Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the progressive era. So, if you want to follow along, this is just the progressive era PowerPoint. Okay, so basically, the progressive era is about 1900 to World War One. The populist era kind of bleeds into the progressive era, and then when World War One comes about, basically progressivism dies. But we'll talk about that later. So, what is progressivism? It's basically a reform movement that lasted from about 1900 to World War One. Basically, it was focused on fixing the problems of industrialization. It kind of was a culmination of the past 30 years of reform attempts, like I said, with the populists. The three presidents during the progressive era are Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. I think Roosevelt and Wilson were true progressives, but William Howard Taft wasn't very progressive. He was more of a conservative style politician. Now, if you go back to the founding of the American nation, Thomas Jefferson had this vision of America being an agrarian republic. He basically said agriculture is what we should focus on. We should be a nation of farmers, not a nation of industrialists and laborers. He said those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people. So Thomas Jefferson's vision of America is uh, is for a nation of farmers. Um, but fast forward, quite a ways, you have industrialization, urbanization, immigration. All of these pose problems to America. How do we deal with this? Um, Industrialization, you have giant corporations that many people see as too powerful. You have bad working conditions, child labor. You'd always had child labor. Don't think that once the industrialists came along, this is the first time we've had child labor. Child labor is the norm probably in human history. Kids always worked on the farm, but now they're working in the factories away from their parents, whereas on the farm they were probably with their parents or with their siblings. You start to have wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people. Now, everyone is getting richer from industrialization, mostly everyone. Most of society benefits, but it's kind of rough at first. Urbanization, you have overcrowded cities, poor sanitation and living conditions. You lack adequate drinking water, decent housing, municipal services, and this is basically because factories started popping up. Millions of people go to the cities because that's where jobs are. Cities just grew too fast for officials to kind of put in place the proper services that were needed in the city. Immigration is also an issue. There's millions of new people with different beliefs. How do you Americanize them? Once we get to World War One, we'll see Europe's fighting and at war with each other. Germany, Austria is fighting Britain, France, Russia. Well, there's millions of immigrants in America who are rooting for different sides to win. So you got to be careful. If you let too many immigrants in, it will kind of pull apart the fabric of the nation. They also contribute to the crowded cities. They bring radicalism. Most immigrants probably weren't radical, but you do have an influx of anarchist, socialist, and communist ideas that aren't traditionally American. They're kind of the antithesis of the American ideal. Okay, who were the progressives? Progressives can be found in all political parties, all social classes, ethnic groups. There's men and women who are progressives. There's lots of different Christian denominations that have progressive leanings. So progressivism isn't a party necessarily, it's more of a movement. Teddy Roosevelt will create the Progressive Party for one presidential election, but we'll kind of get to that. Basically, what do progressives believe? They accept that industrialization is here, but they're outraged at the inequalities it produces. They have a faith in progress in science, and they believe in government intervention. So progressives are big pushers of government intervention. Progressives claim to speak for the little guy, but in a lot of cases, to solve problems, progressives rely more and more on experts in the bureaucracy to organize society, and that often crushes the little guy. And if you think of today, here's kind of the legacy of progressivism, one of them. Uh, let's say Congress passes a law. Let's say the law is this high in the amount of pages it takes to pass. The amount of regulations that the bureaucracy will put in place to implement that law will be a stack, 100 times higher. So a lot of the laws that we follow today aren't even laws, they're just regulations by bureaucracies. So, in a way, today, Congress doesn't actually pass most of the things we have to follow. Um, Bureaucracies pass them as regulations, and that's not the way America was set up. I don't think the founders envisioned us following a bureaucracy or going to jail, or getting fined if we don't follow the regulations of a bureaucracy. They would have said Congress has a job to do that, but in a way, Congress has kind of given that responsibility over to bureaucracies. So that's kind of one way progressivism has hurt the little guy. Um, so it's kind of a trade-off. There's some things that progressives do that are good, that most Americans agree with. There's some things that they do that are bad that a lot of Americans, don't like. So basically, industrialization, urbanization, immigration caused new social and political problems, and we need to bring about reforms to fix this. Some progressives also want to take big business down a notch. They think too much power in the hands of business has caused some of these problems. Some want to focus on making government more honest. Government is pretty dishonest, especially I would say local government or state government because you have so many political machines. So they want to fix that. Jane Addams, she was one of the most ardent progressive reformers, uh, one of the most famous progressive reformers. She said, if the street is not cleaned by the city authorities, no amount of private sweeping will keep the tenement from grime. If the garbage is not properly collected and destroyed, a tenement house mother may see her children sicken and die of diseases from which she alone is powerless to shield them. And although her tenderness and devotion are unbounded, she cannot even secure untainted meat for her household unless the meat has been inspected by city officials. So you kind of see this belief among progressives that the old way of doing things was individualistic. If your street is dirty, if there's garbage, the individual is responsible for his own neighborhood. Even back in the day, the late 1700s, 1800s, you would probably grow your own food on the farm, so you didn't have to worry about it being inspected because you knew it was safe because you grew it or your neighbor did who you know. Now, fast forward to industrialization, you'd have no idea where your food's coming from. The cities are so crowded, you can't clean up your part of the neighborhood. So basically, you see the old way of fixing things was individuals fix them, the new way is government has to fix them. So Jane Addams is kind of a good example of a progressive. She had a middle class upbringing, went to a good college, and basically she kind of just felt smothered and sickened by all the advantages she had and decides that she wants to dedicate her life to helping those who suffer. She visits London after college and goes to this place called Toynbee Hall. It's basically a shelter that provides services to the poor, education, childcare, employment, housing, and she decides to bring this back to America. She starts the Whole House in Chicago. It provides services to the poor. Eventually, it grows into 13 some buildings. These settlement houses stop popping up all over the country as more and more reformers start building them. You can kind of see some pictures of these houses. Another kind of big thing that happened was something called the social gospel. Walter Rauschenbusch basically had this idea that Christianity should not focus so much on saving souls. That was kind of that's a traditional Christianity. That's what Christianity preaches. Christianity shouldn't focus on that, but should focus on making the world a better place. And often, these social gospel followers believe that progressive ideas were the best way to kind of fix society. You had a group called muckrakers. They're basically journalists who point out all the problems with society. Lincoln Steffens wrote a series of articles called The Shame of the Cities. There's a link there if you'd like to read it, just talking about how terrible the living conditions are in the city. Jacob Riis writes How the Other Half Lives. I'll show you some of his pictures later. Ida Tarbell wrote The History of Standard Oil, which was basically criticizing John D. Rockefeller's business practices. Basically, these muckrakers only focus on the terrible things going on in society, and Teddy Roosevelt actually coins the term muckraker. There's a really famous book called The Pilgrim's Progress. It's about this character who has to kind of go on this journey to make it to the celestial city. It's kind of a metaphor for the Christian life. But in this book, there's this character who always looks down at the ground, looks down at the filth, and is always raking it up. And you can see I have a picture on slide 19. They never look up to see the good things in life. So basically, Teddy Roosevelt doesn't like these muckrakers, and he's saying, you guys only focus on the negative in society. Put a good story in there once in a while. Probably the most famous muckraker is Upton Sinclair. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland in the 1870s. He went to City College of New York when he was 14 years old. He's a good writer. He writes for Appeal to Reason. It's a newspaper with socialist leanings. He goes to Chicago to work in the meatpacking industry, and his job is to write articles about how bad the working conditions are. So he wants to talk about the plight of the worker. Later on, this book or these articles get published in book form called The Jungle. It did show the harsh working conditions of people, but more importantly, it showed how unsanitary the meat production was. He talks about fingers getting chopped off and going in the meat. He talks about piles of rat feces just being scooped up with the meat. He talks about rusty nails falling in the meat. Just kind of all kinds of disgusting things that you wouldn't want going into your food. Because of his book, the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act get passed in 1906. So here's an example of a progressive reform taking place. And to be honest, I don't know if I would label it just progressive. No American, regardless of their political party, wants to eat a can of meat that has a finger in it. So basically, this is something all Americans can agree on. It happened during the progressive era, so basically the progressives get the credit, but all Americans want their food clean, so this isn't just progressives. Upton Sinclair famously said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." So nobody cared about the bad working conditions. When people read The Jungle, they don't say, "Oh man, those workers really get hurt on the job a lot. They have poor conditions. They're unsafe." No, they didn't worry about that. They worried about how terrible the food was, and that's kind of what everyone focuses on. Many progressive leaders are women. I told you how during the populist era, a lot of populist leaders are women. Well, that's also true of the progressives. Here's just a few. Florence Kelley, she was an early advocate for the Settlement House. She becomes the head of the National Consumers League. She forms a National Child Labor Committee. She lobbies the federal government to stop child labor. She does have some success. In Mueller v. Oregon, the state upholds an Oregon state law limiting the workday for women to 10 hours a day. The Keating-Owens Act of 1916, it banned the sale of interstate goods produced in factories that employed children as laborers. Later on, the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. Remember how I said the Supreme Court tends to support property rights and individual rights? The Supreme Court would say, a family gets to decide whether or not their children work, not the state. So you can't ban the children from doing something the parents would support. And a lot of kids have to go to work to kind of help provide for their families. An important kind of progressive lawyer or legal mind is Louis Brandeis. He presents a brief to the Supreme Court in the Mueller case. He changes tactics, and this is what the progressives do a lot. They don't really focus on the Constitution. They more focus on whether or not something is good or bad for society in their mind. So example, talking about how long women should be able to work on the job. He doesn't say, anything about the Constitution. He says, here's social scientific evidence and here's statistics that show that working long hours is bad for women, bad for society. Well, the point of the Constitution is, a law. You don't look at whether it's good or bad for society. You look at whether it's constitutional. There's lots of laws that are probably bad for society or good for society, and that's not how you judge them. You judge them on whether they're constitutional or not. That's a judge's job. That's what the whole legal system is supposed to be about. he kind of changes tactics. The Supreme Court says the two sexes differ in structure of the body, in the functions to be performed by each, in the amount of physical strength. This difference justifies legislation to compensate for some of the burdens which rest upon her. So some people in the Supreme Court agreed with Brandeis. Florence Kelley, she convinces Illinois to outlaw child labor. She gets Illinois to provide public assistance to the mother with dependent children. She gets a minimum wage law passed. And you can basically see on slide 32 all of these reforms, getting children out of the workforce. You can see how it really works. Around 1900, there's a sharp decline in the amount of children working in factories, and a lot of them start going to school. Women's suffrage is also a big movement in the progressive movement. They advocate for the right to vote. Some women decide to get kind of rowdy with their tactics. Let's protest publicly, let's hold rallies. Women can vote in some states, so like out west in Wyoming, Colorado, women can vote. They just want the nationwide vote. Probably the most famous suffragette is Carrie Chapman Catt. She studied law, was a female superintendent at a school. She runs the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She lobbies Congress to get the vote nationwide. She works to pass referendums at the state level. She wants to recruit wealthy and well-educated women to kind of speak in the communities. She also focuses on lower class women, women of all races. So she kind of has a all of the above approach. Alice Paul is kind of seen as a more radical suffragette. She was a social activist. She has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She ran the National Women's Party. She doesn't like this state-by-state approach. She wants an amendment to the Constitution, so it's a nationwide effort. She was involved in protests. She picketed the White House during World War I. She argued, how can you fight for democracy in Europe when you deny it to women at home? She gets arrested. She goes on hunger strike. She's force-fed by the authorities. Kind of seen as a troublemaker by Wilson. Wilson doesn't like these tactics, but they end up working, and women do get the right to vote. You can kind of see on slide 39 the map of when women could vote in certain states. So out west, women could vote a lot sooner than women in the east. So the 19th Amendment gets passed that gives women the right to vote. So it's ratified in 1920. One of the biggest examples of a tragedy during this era is the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. In 1911 in New York, fire breaks out in this building where a lot of women work. The doors had been locked because the managers of the building would lock the doors because they didn't want employees sneaking shirts or textiles out. So it's kind of this measure to protect against theft. Women get trapped up on the top floors of the building. Many women burn to death. Some of them jump off the building to escape the fire. 146 women die, and if the doors hadn't been locked, if there had been proper fire escapes, probably none of them would have died. But you can imagine the horror as New Yorkers watch women fall to their deaths because of this. I got a lot of pictures kind of taken of the time. It was a very kind of tragic incident. A lot of the women were young women who were engaged. Sometimes they identified them by their engagement rings. A factory commission is set up. Senator Robert Wagner, Al Smith, and Frances Perkins. They'll all be famous reform politicians later on, kind of in the 20s and 30s. But they form a commission to make sure this never happens again. So they put sprinklers in buildings. They say there has to be fire escapes. They say you can't lock the doors when workers are there. So they reform a lot of things so that a tragedy like this never happens again. A real famous political reformer was Robert La Follette. He's a Wisconsin Republican. He climbs the ladder just like any other politician, kind of was a good Republican. But then he kind of has a change of heart and decides to become a progressive. So he stays Republican, but he's a progressive Republican. He institutes a lot of reforms or gets the ball rolling. he introduces something called the direct primary, or kind of advocates for it. Basically, before the direct primary, um, the parties would pick the candidates that the people would vote on. Um, La Follette changes that. He wants the people to select who the candidates are, and then also vote on the candidates. Three other important reforms that kind of get passed are the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. You can kind of read what those are about, but those are ways of putting more power in the hands of the people. The 17th Amendment gets passed. This is the direct election of senators. So basically, before this amendment, the state legislators would elect the senators. So the people did not get to vote for the senators. But after this, the 17th Amendment, people directly vote for their senator. Another big issue during the Progressive Era is kind of the struggle for civil rights for blacks. The two most important black intellectuals are Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington's the more famous of the two. He wants civil rights, but he works kind of on a slower track, a track of gradual civil rights. Basically, he says, we can't get everything we want right now because most whites, especially in the South, aren't ready for that. But if we work hard, if we get an education, if we are good American citizens, they'll see that we're just like them slowly over time, and they'll give us our civil rights. So he has more of a slow, kind of gradual approach to civil rights. I got quite a bit of quotes from his writings. You can kind of read there and get a feel for what he thinks. W.B. Du Bois is a lot different. He's not radical, but he's more pushing the envelope, I guess you could say. He basically says, Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise, that's what they called his gradual approach. Basically, that'll never get us there. It'll take too long. Why should we have to wait for our civil rights? We deserve them now. The Civil War partly was fought to give us our rights, and now we're being denied them. So he doesn't want a slow approach. He says we can't be successful unless we have our rights. So, like Booker T. Washington said, you might not be able to vote, you might not be able to sit in the same restaurant, but work hard at your business, acquire property, build up your farm, and become a prominent member of society, and then you'll kind of be accepted. W.B. Du Bois says, how can you build up your business, your farm, when your rights, your property rights are constantly being violated? If we don't have our rights, we can't do what you say we should do. So basically, Du Bois wants rights, civil rights right now. So the main three he kind of focused on were the right to vote, civic equality, and education for the young. He's involved with something called the Niagara Movement. It's called that because Du Bois and other black leaders meet at Niagara Falls in 1905. They denounce gradual progress. They call for blacks to be educated in history, literature, philosophy, things that will help them kind of reform American society. A few years later, the NAACP gets founded. There was a famous attempted lynching in Springfield, Illinois in 1908. There was the white people there rioted. Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, Mary White, Ovington, they formed the NAACP. And basically, the NAACP's goal is to use the courts to get civil rights for blacks. So we'll talk more about them when we get to the 1950s, but from the 19 teens all the way to the 1950s, the NAACP is working really hard to implement civil rights for blacks through the court system. The Progressive Era also addresses many areas of society that need fixing, such as public safety, labor laws, political reform. But there's also a dark side to progressivism. This usually doesn't get talked about in textbooks, but it's really fascinating. There's a huge movement in America called eugenics. Basically, it was a movement to fix society's problems through race breeding and sterilization. So, the way we get rid of criminals is we make sure people that have a tendency towards being criminal can't reproduce. the way we get rid of diseases is we make sure that people that might have those genes don't breed. Basically, it was taking the idea of, if you raise cattle or sheep or pigs, anything on the farm, you kind of look for the best set to breed together so you can have the best calf or the best lamb. That's what eugenicists did. Is they said we should only let the best people breed, um, and then we'll fix society's problems. So it's kind of a dark scientific approach to these problems. Um, Tens of thousands of Americans are sterilized against their will. A court, a state law will rule that they are unfit to reproduce or feeble-minded. That's kind of a catch-all term in some of these laws, feeble-minded. If you don't just look right, if you seem a little off or you're a little slow, that's justification to sterilize you. And this does happen to tens of thousands of people. Woodrow Wilson, he's going to be president during the Progressive Era. He's kind of the poster boy, I guess you could say, for progressivism as far as in the political realm. When he was governor of New Jersey, he created something called the Board of Examiners of Feeble-Minded, Epileptics, and Other Defectives. And basically, they would determine when procreation is inadvisable. So we're going to judge citizens and take away their rights to have a family. There were forced sterilizations in the United States, like I said. So Wilson is a big advocate of this. Margaret Sanger, she was an early advocate for birth control. She founded Planned Parenthood, which is still around today. She believed that mothers were strained with the amount of children they had, so she fights for access to birth control. She gets arrested a number of times. She was a big supporter of eugenics. She talked about this in her book, The Pivot of Civilization, and her other writings. She said the emergency problem of segregation and sterilization must be faced immediately. Every feeble-minded girl or woman should be segregated during the reproductive period. We prefer the policy of immediate sterilization, of making sure that parenthood is absolutely prohibited to the feeble-minded. She spoke to the women of the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s. She worked on something called the Negro Project, which was giving birth control and using other eugenic methods such as sterilization, getting them into the black community. She says she wanted less black people, less of the black race, and she used black ministers to kind of sell this idea. So she kind of said, the black community won't trust me, but they might trust one of their own, kind of selling this idea on them. There's a famous Supreme Court case in the 1920s called Buck v. Bell. There's a young woman named Carrie Buck. She's an inmate in the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. Basically, the institution wants to sterilize Buck because she's feeble-minded. This case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that she can be sterilized. Justice Oliver Holmes Jr. is kind of this progressive justice. He says in his majority opinion, Carrie Buck is a feeble-minded white woman who is committed to the state colony. We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So she was sterilized. If you want to read a book, I would suggest War Against the Weak, Eugenics and America's Campaign to Create a Master Race. It's a very interesting book. I've read it. It talks about how big the eugenics movement was in the United States and the world, but he mostly focuses on in America. Hitler got some of his ideas about race from these eugenics, these Americans who kind of promote this idea of eugenics. So it's kind of a dark period of progressive history, but that's a good book. So that's all about the Progressive Era.